Imagine being trapped in complete darkness, wedged so tightly into a narrow cave passage that you can't even turn your head. Your legs are pinned beneath a massive rock, and the only thing keeping you company is the sound of your own labored breathing echoing off the cold limestone walls. Now imagine that the entire world knows exactly where you are, can hear your voice through the stone, but is utterly powerless to save you. In 1925, this is exactly what happened to Floyd Collins, and over the following 18 days, what unfolded would become one of the most publicized disasters in American history. As always, if any of the visuals cause you discomfort, it might be best for your well-being to step away. Floyd Collins was born in 1887 in Barron County, Kentucky, to a family that made their living from the land. By the early 1920s, Floyd had developed an intense fascination with caves, not just for exploration, but for their commercial potential. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky had become a major tourist attraction, and cave owners in the region were making substantial amounts of money charging visitors to tour their underground properties. Floyd's family owned a cave called Crystal Cave, and Floyd had spent years exploring and mapping it, hoping it would be his family's ticket to prosperity. But Crystal Cave had one major problem. It was located far from the main road, making it difficult for tourists to access. Floyd became obsessed with finding a cave entrance closer to the highway, and this obsession led him to a place called Sand Cave in January of 1925. On January 30th, Floyd squeezed into a narrow passage he was exploring, convinced it would open up into a magnificent cave system that would make his fortune. Instead, what he found would seal his fate in the most horrifying way imaginable. The entrance to Sand Cave was barely large enough for a man to fit through, and the passage Floyd was exploring required him to crawl on his stomach through narrow, twisting corridors. At one point, he had to navigate through a particularly tight squeeze where the ceiling dropped so low that he had to lie flat on his chest and push himself forward using only his toes. During this maneuver, approximately 55 feet below the surface, disaster struck. As Floyd pushed forward, his foot dislodged a 27-pound rock from the cave ceiling. The rock tumbled down and pinned his left ankle against the cave wall, trapping him in a space barely wider than his shoulders. Face down in near freezing temperatures, with water constantly dripping from above, he was stuck in a space too narrow to reach down and free himself. When Floyd didn't return home that evening, his family grew concerned. His younger brother Homer entered Sand Cave the next morning and found Floyd wedged in the passage. Homer desperately tried to free his brother, but the angle was impossible. He couldn't get enough leverage to move the rock, and the area was so narrow that only one person could work at a time. Floyd was conscious and talking, and that's when the nightmare truly began, because Floyd would remain conscious and aware throughout most of the torture that followed. Floyd's predicament spread rapidly through the local community, and soon volunteers began arriving at Sand Cave to attempt a rescue. A local reporter named William Burke, Skeets Miller, working for the Louisville Courier-Journal, heard about the story and traveled to the area. Miller was a small man, standing just 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing about 117 pounds, which meant he could actually squeeze through the narrow passage to reach Floyd. Miller's first encounter with Floyd was shocking. Crawling through 150 feet of narrow, twisted passages, some so tight he had to exhale completely to squeeze through, he finally reached the trapped man. Floyd was stuck in what Miller would later describe as a hell hole, a cramped, wet, freezing chamber where Floyd lay on his side with his face pressed against the cold stone. Despite his desperate situation, Floyd was remarkably lucid. He told Miller about his dreams of finding a great cave, about his family, and about how he could feel the circulation cutting off in his trapped leg. Miller's reports from inside the cave captivated the nation. It was 1925, and for the first time in history, Americans could follow a disaster almost in real time through newspaper reports. Miller's vivid, emotional accounts of his conversations with Floyd were published daily, and suddenly Floyd Collins became the most talked-about person in America. Thousands of people began traveling to Sand Cave, turning the rescue site into a bizarre carnival atmosphere with food vendors and curious onlookers. Multiple rescue attempts were organized, each more desperate than the last. Volunteers tried digging down to Floyd from above, but the unstable cave ceiling made this extremely dangerous. Others attempted to widen the passage around him, but there was a risk of more rocks falling when someone worked near Floyd. A harness was placed around Floyd, and rescuers managed to lift him slightly, but they couldn't get enough leverage to free his trapped foot, and the effort only caused him more agony. The conditions Floyd endured were almost unimaginable. The temperature in the cave hovered around 54 degrees Fahrenheit, but the constant dripping water and his inability to move meant hypothermia was setting in. Rescuers brought him food, water, and even a light bulb connected to an extension cord to provide some warmth and light. But these small comforts did little to ease his suffering. Floyd developed pneumonia from the cold and dampness, and his trapped leg was slowly dying from lack of circulation. On February 4th, 6 days into his ordeal, a rockfall in the passage leading to Floyd made it impossible for anyone to reach him anymore. The man who had been talking to rescuers, joking with reporters, and maintaining his hope was now completely cut off from the outside world. He was still alive somewhere in the darkness, but no one could reach him. The decision was then made to dig a vertical shaft straight down to where Floyd was trapped. This was a massive undertaking that required heavy equipment, engineers, and round-the-clock work. The National Guard was called in to manage the growing crowds and assist with the rescue operation. For the next 2 weeks, crews worked frantically to dig through 55 feet of rock and soil, racing against time to reach Floyd before it was too late. On February 16th, 17 days after Floyd first became trapped, the rescue shaft finally reached the passage where he lay. A rescuer named Johnny Gerald was lowered down to reach him, and what he found was devastating. Floyd Collins was dead. His body was cold, and from the condition he was in, it appeared he had likely died around February 13th, 3 days before they reached him. He had spent his final days in complete darkness and isolation, knowing that people were desperately trying to reach him, but seeing that they weren't fast enough. The recovery of Floyd's body became another ordeal. The passage was still too narrow to pull him out, so the body was left in place while authorities decided what to do. Eventually, Floyd's father made the painful decision to leave his son's body in Sand Cave, and the cave was subsequently sealed. However, 2 months later, the family changed their mind, and Floyd's body was finally extracted and buried in a nearby cemetery. But even in death, Floyd Collins could not find peace. In a bizarre twist, his body was later moved to Crystal Cave, the very cave his family had hoped would make their fortune, and displayed as a tourist attraction in a glass-topped coffin. It wasn't until 1989, 64 years after his death, that Floyd was finally laid to rest in a proper grave. Floyd Collins' death had a profound impact on cave safety and rescue procedures. His tragedy demonstrated the need for proper equipment, training, and protocols when it came to cave exploration and rescue operations. Miller, the reporter who crawled down to comfort Floyd multiple times, won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the disaster, and the story remained in the American consciousness for decades. The Sand Cave tragedy was a perfect storm of ambition, bad luck, and the painful reality that sometimes, no matter how hard people try or how much they care, a person simply cannot be rescued. Floyd died doing what he loved, pursuing a dream he believed would change his family's life, trapped in a space so confined that there was nothing anyone could do. even as the world watched and countless people tried to help. And unfortunately, Floyd's story is far from unique in the world of cave disasters. A few decades later, another location in Florida, a cave system so deep and complex it would prove deadly even for the most experienced divers, would claim dozens of lives. But that's a story for another video. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to write it in the comments.